Buddha times Hume, The Labyrinth. Sometime around 1740 in Edinburgh, a young Scottish philosopher sat down to write an appendix to a book he had just finished publishing. He was 29 years old. The book was called A Treatise of Human Nature. It contained a chapter on personal identity that many scholars now consider one of the most brilliant sections in Western philosophy. And he was writing this appendix because, reading back through his own argument, he had noticed something he could not make hold together. His name was David Hume, and in that appendix, near the end, he wrote something remarkable, not a solution, not a defense, a confession. He wrote, "I find myself involved in such a labyrinth. I must confess." Read that slowly. The man who had described the self more precisely than perhaps any philosopher before him, the man who had shown he believed exactly what the self is and is not, could not put his own argument together. He had built it. He had followed it where it went. And when he stood back and looked at the result, he could not make it consistent. He was in a labyrinth of his own making. 25 centuries earlier, a wandering teacher in northern India had performed almost the same investigation. He too had looked for a unified, persistent self behind the flow of experience. He too had failed to find one, but he was not troubled by what he had failed to find. He said that the missing self is not the problem. He said the labyrinth, that specific bewilderment at not finding what everyone assumes must be there, is not a wrong turn. It is a door. Tonight, we are going to walk through what David Hume found in his study in Edinburgh, and what the Buddha found in meditation 25 centuries earlier, where the two discoveries meet, and they meet with astonishing precision, where they part ways, and they part on a question so subtle that many careful readers of Hume have missed it, and many careful readers of the Buddha have missed it too. And what that parting means for you, sitting where you are, right now, because the puzzle that Hume could not solve, the Buddha had already reframed, not because he answered Hume's question better, because he refused to ask it. We covered the 5 hindrances last time. The 5 states of mind, the Buddha said, cripple the mind's performance at almost everything, from meditation to daily life. Sensual desire pulling at you, ill will burning, sloth and torpor weighing you down, restlessness scattering you, uncertainty holding you back. 5 obstacles. And underneath most of them, hidden in plain sight, one root: identification. The unquestioned assumption that what you are is this body, these feelings, this stream of thoughts, that all of it is mine, that the aching of the joints, the swell of anger, the flash of a wanting mind is me. Tonight, the analysis that begins to loosen that identification. The move that, in the canon, comes before almost everything the path can do. Without it, the hindrances have something to grip. With it, even beginning it, they lose the thing they were clinging to. Before we go there, one small historical detail is worth mentioning. Hume, in the mid-1730s, spent about 3 years in France, in a small town called La Flèche, in the west of the country. He was writing the treatise during those years. The town happened to house a well-known Jesuit college, and one of the Jesuit fathers at that college, a man named Charles-François Dolu, had traveled through Asia in earlier years and had personally met a Tibetan missionary who taught Buddhist philosophy in Rome. A modern scholar named Alison Gopnik at Berkeley has raised the intriguing possibility that Hume may have encountered Buddhist ideas through Dolu. She is careful in the claim. She does not say it happened. She says it was possible. What we can say standing where we stand, is this. If the deep parallels we are about to explore between Hume's treatise and the Buddha's teaching on the aggregates are a coincidence, they are a remarkable coincidence. We are not going to try to answer that historical question tonight. What we are going to do is walk both sides of the parallel, carefully, at full strength. Hume at full strength, because he deserves it. Because he is one of the greatest philosophers Western thought has ever produced. Because the argument he raised has never really been answered by the tradition he was writing against. Because the labyrinth he confessed himself lost in is not a failure of his. It is a mark of how far he went. And the Buddha at full strength, because his response to the same discovery is one of the most extraordinary moves in the history of human thought. Not a rival theory, not a better answer to the same question. Something else. A refusal of the question itself in favor of something more useful than any answer could be. Here is the question that will hang over everything we say tonight. What if the self you can't find was never the problem? What if losing it was the answer? Hume looked. He couldn't find the self he expected to find. He was troubled. He wrote a book. He wrote another book. In the second one, he quietly stopped discussing the self entirely. The Buddha looked. He couldn't find the self he had once expected to find either. He was not troubled. He built a path, same investigation, same finding. Two completely different responses, and in the difference between them, a philosophy and a practice. That is what we are going to walk through tonight. First, Hume in his study, in his own words, at the height of his powers, and then in the labyrinth. Then, the Buddha's parallel analysis in the canon, and the point where the two men, in effect, part ways. And finally, what that parting means for someone who is not a philosopher or a monk, but a person sitting somewhere, listening. Someone who has lived long enough to have noticed that the self they thought they were is harder to locate than it used to seem. Let us begin where Hume began, in the study, with the introspective method, and with a passage that, once you have read it, is very difficult to unread. Chapter 1. Hume's Investigation. Hume was young when he wrote the treatise. He had gone to France in his early 20s specifically to think and to write, without the distractions of Edinburgh society. He was ambitious in the way only a young philosopher can be. He intended to do for the mind what Isaac Newton had done for the natural world. To find, by careful observation, the laws that govern human nature. And the first thing he wanted to find, the anchor of everything else, was the self, the I that thinks and feels and observes. His method was direct. He would look inward, as intimately as he possibly could, into what he called himself. He would attend to what he actually found there, and he would refuse to assume anything he could not, in that attending, discover. Here is what he reported. I never can catch myself at any time without a perception. Read that carefully. The claim is quiet, but it is enormous. Every time Hume tried to find the I that was doing the observing, the self that supposedly stands behind experience, having it, he found only more experience. Heat or cold, light or shade, a brief liking, a brief aversion. Never the self having those experiences, only the experiences themselves. There is a mirror moment here for you. Try it, even briefly. Attend to what you are experiencing right now. The sound of this voice, the feel of sitting, the play of thoughts in the background. Now, try to attend to the one attending, the listener behind the listening. the knower behind the knowing. You may find, as Hume did, that whenever you look for the knower, you find only another piece of knowing, another thought, another sensation, never the one having them. This is not a small observation. It is, in some ways, the observation on which everything else in tonight's video will hinge. Because for centuries in the Western tradition, the assumption had gone unquestioned that the self is the thing that has experiences. The having of experiences was supposed to require a haver, a subject, an owner of the experiencing. And Hume, having sat down to check, because it was the sort of thing he thought a philosopher ought to check, reported back that when he looked, he did not find that owner. He found the having, but no haver. This was Hume's opening move, and it led him directly to what he called the bundle. If, whenever we look for the self, we find only perceptions, then the self, whatever it is not something behind the perceptions. It is, at most, the perceptions themselves, bundled together, succeeding one another with what Hume called an inconceivable rapidity. A collection, not a substance, not a soul, a stream. Note the exact word Hume used, because it matters. He called this stream a perpetual flux and movement, not motion, movement. A subtle distinction, but the word carries something. Motion suggests something moving through space. Movement, in Hume's usage, suggests something that is itself changing all the way through, without a still center. The self, on this account, is not a thing in motion. It is a movement without a mover. He offered a further image to help the reader see it. The mind, he suggested, is a kind of theater. On this stage, perceptions appear and disappear in ceaseless succession. They pass across, they slip away, they return, they mingle together in endless variety. A stage full of appearances, with no audience anywhere. Hume, to his credit, saw the trap in his own image. He warned the reader immediately not to be misled by the theater metaphor. Because a theater is a place where actors appear, but in Hume's account there is no place, no back wall, no wooden building, just the appearing itself. The metaphor was there to make the point vivid, and then to be discarded before it did any damage. That was where he thought he had arrived. And for the section of the Treatise on Personal Identity, that is where he left it. Then he wrote an appendix. And it is in the appendix that everything came apart. Here is the important thing about Hume's trouble in the appendix. It is not what most casual readers assume. It is not that Hume, having proven to his own satisfaction that the self is a bundle, then panicked at the loss of his soul. He did not. Hume's temperament was, on all the evidence we have, one of the most equable in the history of philosophy. His trouble was technical, precise, and he stated it precisely. He said, in effect, there are two principles I cannot make consistent with each other. First, every distinct perception is a distinct existence. Each moment of experience, each flicker of heat or cold or thought is its own thing, separate, its own event. Second, the mind never perceives any real connection among these distinct existences. That is, when you attend to one perception and then another, you never actually observe a bond between them. You just observe them. 2 moments, and then 2 more. Now put those 2 principles together. If perceptions are distinct existences, and the mind never perceives any real connection between them, then what unifies them into a bundle? What makes this collection of perceptions one mind, rather than many minds, or none? What binds the theater together so that the perceptions are not, as it were, scattered? Hume could not answer. He had built the bundle, and when he asked what holds the bundle together, he found he had no answer. That was his labyrinth, not existential dread, a specific structural puzzle. Two principles, honestly stated, that he could not reconcile. And Hume, honest philosopher that he was, wrote it down. He said, in effect, "I have found something I cannot solve, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. It is worth pausing on that, because it is rare." Most philosophers, having built a system, defend it. They find ways around the objections. They add epicycles. Hume, at the peak of his powers, in the Appendix to what he considered his most important work, said, "I have built this, and there is a problem in it that I cannot fix." It is a mark of intellectual seriousness that has few parallels, and it is also a warning. The binding problem, how distinct moments of experience add up to one continuous mind, has never really been solved in the tradition Hume was writing in. It gets renamed, it gets reformulated, but nobody in the 280 years since has taken Hume's two principles and produced a stable account of what unifies the perceptions into a single self, which is one reason it is worth listening carefully to what the Buddha did with the same discovery. But before we get there, one philosophical footnote, briefly, because it belongs here. The strongest Western objection to Hume's account came from a man Hume had, in a way, woken up. Immanuel Kant, in Germany, read Hume, and later wrote that it was the objection of David Hume that first interrupted my dogmatic slumber. Kant was speaking there specifically about Hume's argument on causation, not about the bundle. But when Kant came to write his own philosophy, he took on the bundle problem too. His answer went like this. There must be, Kant argued, some unifying principle behind experience, or experience would not hang together. The perceptions would not add up to a mind at all. He called this unifying principle the transcendental unity of apperception, which is a formidable sounding phrase for a fairly simple idea. It is the I think, the sense that all these perceptions are being had by one perceiver, that must be able to accompany all of my representations, if they are to be mine at all. But notice what Kant was not saying. He was not saying that there is a soul. He was not saying that there is a substantial self, a thing behind the perceptions. He was very careful about this. The I think, he insisted, is a formal condition of experience, not a discoverable substance, a structural requirement, not a hidden entity, which puts Kant closer to the Buddhist account than most readers of Kant realize. Because the Buddha would have said, and as we will see, in effect, did say, that felt unity, that sense of an I behind everything, is not the soul. It is a construction, something the mind assembles moment by moment, a verb, not a noun. Kant, in his own vocabulary, was pointing at almost the same thing. We will come back to that. Now, one last piece of the Hume story, because it becomes important later on. About 9 years after the treatise, Hume rewrote his philosophy in a shorter, more readable book called The Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding. Better prose, wider audience. And when he came to the discussion of personal identity, the section that had led him into the labyrinth, he left it out. He simply stopped talking about the self. The philosopher, who had gone farther on this question than almost anyone in his tradition, quietly walked away from it in his mature work. And when Hume was dying, in the summer of 1776, his younger contemporary James Boswell, Samuel Johnson's biographer, a deeply religious man who was terrified of death himself, came to visit him. Boswell went, one suspects, half hoping to find a philosopher, at last regretting his skepticism. Wishing, perhaps, that he had believed in something more solid, Boswell found the opposite. In the private account he wrote of that visit, Boswell said of Hume, "He seemed to be placid and even cheerful." When Boswell pressed him, asked whether the thought of annihilation, the thought of not existing at all, did not disturb him, Hume answered that it gave him not the least uneasiness. No more, he said, than the thought that he had not existed before he was born. 7 weeks later, Hume was dead. Whether that equanimity came from philosophy, or from temperament, or from something in Hume's character that had never quite depended on the labyrinth being solved, we cannot know from the outside. But the Buddha, if he had been in that room, would have recognized it, because there is a teaching in the Buddhist tradition, one we have touched on in earlier videos, called Maranasati, mindfulness of death, and its aim is precisely this quality. Not a denial of mortality, not a philosophical trick to make it not matter, but a facing of it that is, somehow, unafraid. A placidity that has stopped clinging without having stopped caring. Hume arrived at that quality by some route we can only partly reconstruct. The Buddha said there is a path to it, a specific, describable path that anyone can walk. So this is where Hume left us. He had performed the introspective investigation as carefully as any philosopher before or since. He had found the bundle. He had described it in prose that people still read for pleasure 280 years later. He had asked what held the bundle together, could not answer, and was honest about it. He had lived his mature life without pretending to have solved the puzzle, and he had died at peace. The Buddha found the same thing when he looked. The bundle, the perceptions, no owner behind them. But when he asked the question that troubled Hume, what holds this bundle together, the Buddha did something Hume never did. He asked whether that was the right question at all. Chapter 2. The Buddhist Parallel. Let us start with what the Buddha found, because it maps onto Hume's finding with almost surgical precision. The Buddhist analysis of what we call self divides it into 5 categories, 5 aggregates. In Pali, the language the Buddha's discourses were preserved in, they are called the pañca khandha, the 5 heaps, or the 5 collections. And when you look carefully at what self actually is, what you find is not one thing, but 5 processes running in parallel. The first is form, in Pali, rupa, the body, the physical dimension, everything material about you, the weight of you, the heat of you, the fact that you take up space. The second is feeling, vedana, not emotion in the modern sense. Something more basic, the bare quality of experience as pleasant, painful, or neutral. Every moment, on this account, carries one of those 3 tones. And it is never quite neutral until you notice. It is always already one of the 3. The third is perception, sanya, recognition, the labeling of experience. That flicker of movement in the corner of your eye, the mind labels it bird or leaf or shadow before you consciously decide anything. That labeling is sanya. The fourth is mental formations, sankhara. This is the widest category. Intentions, volitions, the formed habits of mind, the ways that thought moves. What you might call, in modern language, your dispositions, your character, your inclinations. But also the moment-by-moment forming of intentions. The reaching, the withdrawing, the deciding, the resisting. And the fifth is consciousness, vijnana, awareness itself, the bare knowing, not the content of what is known, that is covered by the other four aggregates, but the fact that there is knowing at all. 5 categories, 5 processes. And the Buddha's claim was this: whatever you look at when you look for the self, whatever you point to when you use the word I, you are pointing at one of these 5, or at all of them together. You are not pointing at a 6th thing behind them. Notice the resemblance to Hume already. Hume said, "I find only perceptions." The Buddha said, "I find only these 5. And when you look for the perceiver, the owner, the I that stands behind, you do not find it. You find another aggregate. You find more experience." Now the Buddha delivered this teaching in what tradition calls his second discourse, the Anatalakkhana Sutta, SN 2259. His first discourse had been on the Four Noble Truths. This was the one that came immediately after. He taught it to the same 5 monks who had heard the first, in a deer park outside the city of Varanasi. And it is said that all 5 of them became fully awakened during the giving of it. The structure of the teaching is elegant. It runs through the 5 aggregates one at a time. For each one, the Buddha makes the same move. Here is how he opens. Form, monks, is not self, but precisely because form is not self. And then he gives the argument. If form were the self, if the body were yours in the deepest sense, if it were what you truly are, then, the Buddha says, you would be able to command it. You could say, "Let my body be thus. Let my body not be thus. Let it stop aching. Let it not grow old." But you cannot, because it is not yours to command, because there is no owner in it. He then repeats the argument for the other 4. Feeling is not self. If feeling were the self, you could command it. Let this experience be pleasant. Let this not be painful. You cannot. Perception is not self. You do not choose what the mind labels. The labeling happens. Mental formations are not self. Intentions arise without your permission. Habits form without your consent. Consciousness is not self. Awareness comes and goes. When you fall into deep sleep, it stops without asking you. 5 times, same argument, each time landing on the same conclusion. This is not self. There is no owner here. And here is where the Buddha and Hume meet, with a precision that can take your breath away. Hume looked for an impression of a unified, persistent self, and found only perceptions. No owner behind them. The Buddha's teaching. Look through each aggregate. Look through form. Look through feeling. Look through perception. Look through mental formations. Look through consciousness. In none of them do you find an owner of the aggregate. In none of them do you find the I that has the aggregate. Only the aggregate itself. Only the having, not the haver. Both traditions find contents. Neither finds the owner of the contents. This is the point of tightest convergence between 2 traditions separated by 25 centuries and half the world. Not identical, we will come to the differences, but at the fulcrum of the analysis, the same finding. There is no proprietor of the perceptions. Now, and this is important, the Buddha immediately noticed that this teaching can be misunderstood, and he was careful to guard against the misunderstanding. In the 109th discourse of the Majjhima Nikaya, MN 109, a monk hears the teaching that the 5 aggregates are not self, and he draws what seems like the obvious conclusion. If the aggregates are not self, he reasons, then there is no self at all, no self anywhere. I have no self. He asks the Buddha to confirm. The Buddha does not confirm. The teaching, the Buddha says, is not there is no self. The teaching is these 5 aggregates are not self. Do not turn a practice into a metaphysical conclusion. Do not take the tool and drop it into philosophy. The move you just made, from not self to no self, is precisely the move the teaching was designed to prevent. This is where Hume and the Buddha part ways, because Hume did exactly what that monk did. Having found no self among the perceptions, Hume concluded that the self is the bundle. He answered the metaphysical question. The Buddha, seeing the same finding, refused to answer it, and told his monks not to answer it either. We will look at that refusal in the next chapter, because it is one of the strangest and most important moves in the history of thought. But first, one more image from a different discourse. In SN 2299, the Leash Sutta, the Buddha gives a picture for what identification with the aggregates looks like from the outside. Imagine a dog. The dog is tied by a leash to a post. The dog cannot leave. Around and around the post, the dog circles. Nose down, then up, then down again. Round and round. Sometimes the dog sits, sometimes stands, sometimes runs. But whatever the dog does, walking, sitting, standing, lying, it stays tethered to the post. The post, the Buddha says, is form, feeling, perception, mental formations, consciousness. The dog is the mind. The circling is the endless returning. This is me. This belongs to me. This is myself. The leash is the identification itself. The practice of seeing not self in this picture is not the deletion of the dog. It is not the elimination of the aggregates. They will keep happening as long as you are alive. The body will keep aching. The feelings will keep coming. The labels will keep landing. The intentions will keep forming. Consciousness will keep flickering. The practice is the loosening of the leash. The circling slows, and at some point, the circling stops, and the dog is free to walk away, not from the aggregates, but from the compulsive returning to them as me, which brings us back to the video we made last time. The 5 hindrances. Sensual desire, grasping at form, wanting more of what is pleasant, wanting less of what is not. That grasping cannot exist without something to grasp at. Without form as mine, there is no target for the wanting. Ill will, the burning that arises when the body and the world do not cooperate with what I want. Without an I that has been thwarted, without a mind that has been trespassed, the burning has nowhere to live. Sloth and torpor, that heavy sinking of the felt body, that dull weight, not evil, but sticky. It clings because I have identified with the body's tiredness, made it mine, made it me. Restlessness, the mind that cannot stop its own turning, cannot stop its own forming of thought. Restlessness feeds on the sense that I must resolve, I must act, I must decide, and soon. An uncertainty, that particular doubt about the path itself, about whether I am the sort of person who could walk such a path, about whether I have the time, the aptitude, the character for it. All 5 hindrances arise from the same root. Identification with the aggregates, taking form as mine, feeling as me, perception as me, mental formations as me, consciousness as me. When identification loosens, when the leash starts to slack, the hindrances do not disappear from the world. Sensual desire still arises. Ill will still stirs. Sloth still weighs. Restlessness still turns. Uncertainty still whispers. But they lose the thing they were clinging to. They no longer have an I to defend, or a mind to protect, or a me to serve. That is the practical stake of the aggregate analysis, not a philosophical position, a loosening. So we come back to the divergence. Same finding, very different responses. Hume asked, "So what is the self?" and answered, "A bundle." The Buddha heard that question and set it down, not because he did not know the answer, because he saw something about the question itself. Chapter 3, same discovery, different response. Not because he did not know the answer, because he saw something about the question itself. Here is what he saw. There is a category of questions in the Buddha's teaching that has a specific technical name, avyakata. In Pali, it means undeclared, or unanswered, or, perhaps most precisely, set aside. It is a category the Buddha applied to a small number of questions that he consistently refused to answer. Is the universe eternal? Avyakata. Not eternal? Avyakata. Is the Tathagata, the awakened one, still existing after death? Avyakata. Not existing? Avyakata. And on the list, alongside these, is there a self? Is there no self? Both of them. Both avyakata. Both refused. The most famous instance comes in the 44th Samyutta, the 10th discourse, SN 4410. A wandering philosopher named Vacchagotta comes to the Buddha with those two very questions. He wants to know, is there a self? Is there no self? Vacchagotta is not being frivolous. He is genuinely trying to work it out. The Buddha does not answer him, not yes, not no. Silence. Vacchagotta, after some time, leaves. Ananda, the Buddha's attendant, is confused. He asks the Buddha why he did not answer. The Buddha's response is one of the most striking passages in the canon. He says, in effect, "If I had said there is a self, I would have sided with those who believe in an eternal, unchanging soul. If I had said there is no self, I would have sided with those who believe that when a person dies, nothing at all persists." Neither answer would have helped Vacchagotta. Neither would have led him toward the ending of suffering. And there is another discourse, MN 72, in which the Buddha gives his general reason for setting such questions aside. To pursue them, he says, is to enter what he calls a thicket of views, a tangle, a jungle, positions that produce more positions, counter views that produce more counter views, without ever loosening the underlying grip that made the questioning painful in the first place. Hume never had this option available to him. Hume asked the metaphysical question, "What is the self, really?" And he answered it. The self, he said, is a bundle of perceptions. That is a metaphysical claim. It says, here is what the self actually is. The Buddha declined to make that kind of claim. Not because he was mystical or evasive, because he had noticed with characteristic clarity that the question itself was doing something. It was fueling exactly the identification that caused the suffering in the first place. Answering it, either way, would extend the fuel rather than remove it. Now, this is a specific reading of the not-self teaching, and it is worth being honest that not every Buddhist teacher reads it this way. The scholar and teacher whose translations we have been following in this series, Thanissaro Bhikkhu of the Thai forest tradition, has argued for this framing more forcefully, perhaps, than any other modern voice. In his essay called No Self or Not Self, he puts it this way: The anatta teaching is not a doctrine of no self, but a not-self strategy, a strategy, not a claim about what exists and what does not. A move you make with your attention, a tool for shedding the clinging that generates the suffering, and, on Thanisaro's reading, opening the way toward the deepest and most durable form of happiness the mind is capable of. That is the whole point of the teaching in this reading, not to settle what the self is once and for all, but to free the mind from the clinging that the settling was supposed to serve. Other respected scholars read the teaching differently. Bhikkhu Bodhi, who has translated more of the Pali Canon into English than almost anyone, argues that the anatta teaching does entail, at its core, the finding that no self exists, that the strategic reading undersells what the Buddha was actually saying. Bhikkhu Sujato has argued similarly. The debate within contemporary Buddhist scholarship is genuine, and it is not settled. For tonight, we are following Thanissaro, not because the other readings are wrong, because Thanisaro's framing marks, with the greatest precision, the exact place where Hume and the Buddha diverge. And that divergence is what makes this pairing so illuminating. Here is what the divergence looks like at the fulcrum. Both Hume and the Buddha found contents, but no owner. Both discovered, by their different methods, that when you look for the I that stands behind experience, you do not find it. You find only more experience. This is where they agree. Hume's response was to ask, so what is the self? And to answer, it is the contents themselves, the bundle, the perceptions in flux and movement. That is a metaphysical answer. It replaces one theory of the self with another. The Buddha's response was different. He noticed that the question, so what is the self, was the very move that kept generating the clinging. Every time you try to nail down what the self is, you are performing an act of identification. You are saying, whatever is answering, whatever is asking, whatever is trying to work this out, that is me, and the clinging follows. So the Buddha did not answer the question. He did not offer a rival theory of the self. He set the question down and turned attention instead to what the clinging actually does, to what happens when it loosens, to what a mind is like when it has stopped trying to work out what it fundamentally is. Two moves from the same finding, opposite directions. And here is where the deepest difference shows. Hume had a diagnosis without a practice. He had described the bundle. He had asked what holds it together. He could not answer. And there was, for Hume, nothing to do next. The philosopher's tools he had, introspection, argument, prose, had brought him as far as they could bring him. Beyond that, silence, or a quiet afterlife of not talking about it. The Buddha had a diagnosis and a path. The Noble Eightfold Path is not the discovery that the aggregates are not self. It is what you do after the discovery. Right view, the first factor of the path, is precisely the seeing that the aggregates are not self. It is not a belief. It is a way of looking. Right intention is the redirection of the mind's aim, away from clinging, toward release. Right mindfulness is the ongoing attention that watches identification arise and watches it relax. Right concentration gives the mind a stable resting place that is not one of the aggregates, a place from which the not-self teaching can be seen clearly rather than argued about. Where Hume had to stop, the Buddha kept going. Not because the Buddha had a better metaphysical theory, because he had a set of practices for what to do with the finding itself. Worth mentioning, briefly, that a modern Western philosopher followed a route very close to Hume's and arrived at a similar view, but reported the experience of arriving very differently. Derek Parfit, in a book called Reasons and Persons, spent much of his career arguing that personal identity does not consist in the existence of some further fact beyond the physical and psychological continuities we can already observe. There is no additional self, he said, over and above the bundle. And he said, explicitly, that he found this view liberating rather than frightening. He credited the Buddhist tradition with having reached the same understanding millennia earlier, and with having understood its emotional consequences more deeply than modern philosophy had. Which brings us back, one more time, to the practical stake. The 5 hindrances from last time arise from identification. Sensual desire grasps form as mine. Ill will burns when my world does not cooperate. Sloth clings because I have made the body's heaviness me. Restlessness turns because I must resolve. Uncertainty freezes because I am not sure. I am the sort of person who can walk such a path. When the I loosens, when the leash slacks in the Buddha's image from the Leash Sutta, the hindrances do not vanish from the world. They still arise, but they lose the thing they were clinging to. They no longer have an owner to serve. That is the payoff of the divergence. Not a philosophical victory over Hume. A practical shift that Hume, given the tools of 18th century Edinburgh, was in no position to make. Chapter 4. Landing. That is the philosophical crux. Now, one more section, the one that matters most. At 65, at 70, at 75, the self does not feel like a bundle. The self feels very fixed, decades of identity, roles accumulated, roles discarded, roles kept. The person who became a parent, that person. The person who became a professional, a spouse, a widow, a widower, a retiree, that person. Every one of those roles over the decades experienced as me, not as an idea, as what you were. Hume's finding, in the abstract, can feel threatening at this stage of a life, as if something is being taken away, at exactly the moment when there is less time to lose things. As if the philosopher, in his study in Edinburgh, were disassembling the very sense of self that a long life had spent decades assembling. But look at what Hume actually found when the bundle was clear. Not distress, not regret, equanimity. Boswell went to him that summer of 1776, expecting to find a philosopher who had come, at the end, to regret his skepticism. He found the opposite, placidity, cheer. A man who had spent his life arguing that what we call the self is a bundle of perceptions, and who was, apparently, unbothered by the prospect of the bundle ceasing. The Buddha's promise, along the different route we have been walking tonight, is the same equanimity, arrived at through practice rather than through temperament. The loosening of the I in the Buddha's teaching is not loss. It is lightening. Something you were carrying, that you did not know you were carrying, is set down. And the older you get, in the Buddha's view, the more available that lightening becomes. Not because age brings wisdom automatically, because age has already loosened many of the identifications that the young cannot yet see through. The career self, in retirement, has already begun to fade. The parent self, in the empty house, has already begun to soften. The physical self, in the aging body, is already being renegotiated, whether you consent to it or not. Life has already been doing some of the loosening. The practice in the Buddha's teaching is to meet that loosening consciously, rather than to be pulled through it against your will. Neither of the two men we have been walking with tonight wins the argument. and neither is meant to. Hume mapped the problem with a precision no philosopher before him had reached. He found the bundle. He was honest about the labyrinth. He could not supply the path forward, and he knew, honestly, that he could not. Everything he wrote is worth reading, and the tradition he was writing against is still trying to catch up with him. The Buddha found the same bundle, refused to call it an answer, and built a path. He was not answering Hume, whom he never knew existed. He was answering a question every human mind sooner or later asks. What am I, really, and what am I supposed to do about it? And answering it in a way that has, for 25 centuries, changed the lives of people who took the answer seriously. Neither of them is wrong about what they found. They differ on what to do with it. So here is the question that has hung over everything we have said tonight. What if the self you can't find was never the problem? What if losing it was the answer? Hume looked for himself. He could not find the self he was looking for. He called it a labyrinth. The Buddha called it a door.